I've been around for long enough to have seen how hard it is for any new tooling to ultimately get embedded and adopted within an organization. There's often resistance, right? So any kind of AI adoption, right, it is a people issue, a process issue, a cultural issue, and almost everyone undervalues and underbakes how hard it is to drive all of that change towards true adoption.
Mark Walker. Mark is the co-founder of AI GTM Studio, a company helping support founders, GTM leaders, realize the power of AI within their GTM systems.
Typically, AI doesn't actually fix a lot of broken processes. What it will do is help improve good processes by taking out repeatable manual labor. And ideally, if you've got, again, good data being fed into it, it will apply pretty good intelligence and insight from lots of unstructured data that would have typically taken a human, or often like a full-time analyst, a lot of time to try and figure out what is this data telling us.
What is your current go-to AI tool, and what do you find yourself using it for on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so look, my go-to AI tool most broadly is Claude, and then there's multiple different facets to that. So sometimes I use Cowork, sometimes I'm using Claude Code, sometimes I'm simply using the browser chat side of things. In terms of a go-to-market AI tool, that obviously is still key to a lot of those tools. But I would say, from an AI perspective, I work across multiple different clients. And so again, I am installing a lot of go-to-market skills through Claude within their teams. But I'm seeing tools like Gong and Lemlist and sort of those I guess what you'd say is like systems of record, right? Like the data capture layer of AI is where there's a lot of great use cases I'm seeing at the moment.
It's really, really interesting that you bring that up, because a huge theme over the last few weeks of the podcast when talking about these AI tools, I've never heard it described the way you just did there. It's almost like data capture. And one of the main points has been building GTM systems on a shaky framework when it comes to data. So it's very easy, and it'd be cool to know whether you found this working with various organizations. A GTM team gets put together and they immediately go, right, we need, X stack of AI tools, and that's going to help us clean everything up and make everything easy. And we're only going to need to work an hour a day and we'll still make loads of money. But then, they kind of add these tools in, but actually the initial data that they're feeding those tools doesn't quite speak to what's actually kind of happening on the page or kind of down below. Is that an issue that you've kind of come across working with organizations, across GTM?
Yeah, 100%. So I think where one of the ways teams are getting AI wrong is they are trying to put AI as a system of execution, right? They're trying to get like that execution layer in, and it's on very shaky foundations, right? There's no clarity in the team about what metrics it's trying to move. The data infrastructure that's built around it isn't in a good shape. They actually haven't even thought through what best practice should look like were humans to be executing against their strategy, let alone AI. So you end up with a bunch of like AI systems who are off building very efficient execution around fundamentally broken processes. And that's why I'm really trying to encourage anyone that I'm working with to think more foundationally to begin with. What metrics do you actually want to move? How are you going to measure success? How are you going to make sure the infrastructure that you build in any execution layer on is in good shape? And do you actually know what best practice looks like? Have you defined, let's say, your playbook? And if not, then there's no hope of you seeing good results.
So kind of take me through it, if that's okay then. What are those initial conversations like? What are those first kind of building blocks that you're putting in place when you do go into an organization? Because I imagine, again, I'm looking at it from the outside, having done this podcast, it seems like everyone, there's a bit of like everyone's being a magpie at the moment and they're just looking for the shiny object, and they see the new shiny tool, or Claude rolled out this, or there's this new GTM tool, and they're like, right, well, if we install that, everything's going to work perfectly. But it sounds like what you're saying is that's very counterintuitive. So what are those first initial conversations that you're having, and what are those first building blocks?
Yeah, for sure. So if I'm starting a new engagement, I will always do a diagnostic, and that diagnostic obviously has a lens of where could AI improve the business, right? That's what people want to know. But they'd probably be surprised that what I'm really looking at would be a similar process that I'd done prior to AI being the hot new thing, right? It's like understanding who's on the team, what are the broken processes, what are the processes that people don't understand or they don't comply with, what's the culture like, what metrics are they trying to drive, right? These are the foundational understandings of, do you actually have a go-to-market team that's working in the first place? And typically AI doesn't actually fix a lot of broken processes. What it will do is help improve good processes by taking out repeatable manual labor where it's unnecessary. And ideally, if you've got, again, good data being fed into it, it will apply pretty good intelligence and insight from lots of unstructured data that would have typically taken a human, or often like a full-time analyst, a lot of time to try and figure out what is this data telling us.
Talk to me about this term I've heard, thrown around a lot. I think you kind of said it there without saying it, but a lot of companies now have this thing where they're like, yeah, we're AI native. We're AI native, like we've got an AI native GTM system.
Yeah.
By the sounds of what you're saying there, like that kind of doesn't exist, because you can sort of, or maybe, sorry, maybe I'm phrasing it wrong. It does exist, but if anything, actually, potentially that's not a very good thing, because you're maybe not thinking about those initial layers before you add execution onto the top. I don't know, maybe I'm spitballing here, but am I onto something here? Talk me through that idea of this sort of AI native GTM system, and what does that actually look like in practice? Because to me, it kind of sounds like a stack of AI tools, on top of a system, and maybe it's nothing more than that. But I'd love to get your perspective on that term.
So I think people mean two different things by it, right? Which is where terms get very, very confusing. My take on what AI native should mean, or really means, is that the organization has only ever known AI, right? And so by that definition, the vast majority of go-to-market teams that existed prior to almost 12 months ago, 6 months ago, cannot be AI native, because they existed prior to the advent of AI. Look, I know AI has been around longer than just the last 6-12 months, but I think the way people currently think of it, it's very new, right? With the explosion of Claude and Claude and so on. Where I think people now mean we're AI native is more of a cultural piece, i.e., we are trying to think AI first. Yeah. And that's what they really mean by it. In other words, before we do anything, before we hire a human to do work, before we buy a new tool to do it, we want to think, could AI be applied to this in practice? And it's not a bad thing per se, right, to think AI natively or to think AI first. But you have to make sure those foundations are in place. Otherwise, as you said, you end up with stacks and stacks of AI tools that are just doing like efficient execution on broken processes.
There's also, again, I had a conversation with a guy called Paul Sullivan last week. He's a kind of CTO, and he's actually written a book about vibe coding. So, really is the expert on that. But one of the problems that he was also discussing, and he's, very positive about vibe coding, but is this idea that now that people can just go and create it and go and do, make whatever tool it is and all this, that's all well and good. But a lot of the time that tool sits on its own little island and is very difficult to then plug into even something as core as a CRM, and trying to do that. So what has been your experience kind of dealing with that when people have got these kind of almost obscure tools, or perhaps they've tried to build something in-house themselves because they're like, well, we don't need to pay an agency to do it or do this because, like you said, we've got Claude Code. We'll just make it ourselves. And then actually they tend to sort of struggle it, and it ends up kind of sitting in isolation. What can teams do to kind of avoid that and sort of toe that line of what can we create ourselves and build ourselves and integrate, and what do we actually need to go and bring in from the outside?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And definitely something I've seen working with clients. They've been very enthusiastic. They've wanted to get their team on board with AI. So the mandate has been everyone needs to go and build with AI, right? Go and build skills, go use core code. And so everyone off they go, right? Very enthusiastic. They burn through a lot of tokens, they build stuff. And it's a dopamine hit, right? You can build something that you and I probably, I mean, I'm not an engineer, right? So
me neither.
Yeah. I'm building stuff that I couldn't have dreamed of building, 6 months ago, 12 months ago. So it's a proper dopamine hit. But the problem is, to your point, you end up with dozens or hundreds of siloed skills and apps that don't speak to each other. They don't work. They break. No one wants to maintain them. So actually, so that initial enthusiasm is ultimately a huch distraction to the organization. It's probably good for the individuals, right, to like understand what the art of the possible with AI. But you have to bring it back to a centralized strategic view, and you really need someone that owns your AI implementation within an organization who can figure out how does everything fit together and where does it make sense for the organization to build versus buy versus maybe bring in an agency to do some of that building, to maintain it, and so on. So I don't know if that answered your question.
That's perfectly, yeah.
The problem is very real, that people building stuff just because they can is exciting, but ultimately becomes problematic at a systematic and an organizational level.
Do you think that's a new kind of job role that's going to start to come out? Because obviously all you ever hear about is the negative side of what it's going to do to the job market and how it's, people are losing jobs. And I'm aware that that's a very real problem. But equally on the other side of things, for example, so I come from within GTM, I'm on the marketing side of things. So I am the opposite of an engineer. I sit and do this conversation, Mark, and, I edit that, put that together and do all the marketing. So, for me, the technical and the sort of product side of things is the opposite end of the spectrum technically for me. But I was on LinkedIn the other day and I was putting a campaign together, and for the first time I was looking at sort of C-suite job titles for our targeting for ad campaigns, and Chief AI Officer came up, and I'd never seen that before. And like you said, AI has been around for a while, but it's only really 6-12 months that it started to accelerate. And I found that really interesting that role exists now. And obviously that's sitting at the top of an organization, but can you kind of see down the line, or even now, having I don't know whether it would sit within HR or, within the dev team. I'm not sure where you think it would sit, or even maybe within GTM. I'm not sure. But do you think there needs to be a dedicated person within the organizations making sure that these tools, much like there's an HR manager to manage a team of people, does there need to be someone to manage a team of tools and agents and all that kind of stuff?
I mean, the simple answer is yes, right?
Of course.
In a go-to-market team, my view is that role has started to be minted, and you'll no doubt have come across it, right? The GTM engineer, right? A go-to-market engineer.
I've heard that, yeah.
Which effectively,
I don't know what it means.
I don't think anyone really does, right?
No, I don't think so either.
It's essentially synonymous with the person who owns AI tooling within an organization and uses it to drive growth. But I don't know if it will survive long term, but like it's the one that, again, when I'm engaging with clients, if they are looking for a long term solution after I've left, they want to hire in a GTM engineer, right? And the broad view is they will look after the AI innovation and application within the go-to-market team. I wonder whether long-term RevOps will become that function, right? So RevOps has long been, unfortunately, I know some really great strategic RevOps people, so it's not diminishing what a good RevOps can be, but overarchingly as a function, it's been demoted over the years to essentially the CRM data monkey. And this is potentially really interesting opportunity for RevOps to own the AI layer within their organization. So I think that that's potentially very exciting. And then if you think broader across the wider organization, should someone be looking after all of AI, like how does it drive HR, finance, operations, then it makes sense, right? It's going to be so pervasive. Someone needs to have an eye on it, and most likely they will report directly to the CEO or the COO, who needs to have that overarching view of how all the bits of the organization fit together.
I love that you brought up this idea of this GTM engineer. It's been such a fun conversation for me to have over the last little while, but even seeing it on LinkedIn and there's discourse there and people doing posts of like, what even does it mean? You know, I went for a coffee last week with my friend who's a headhunter within GTM. And even he was saying, he was like, that's, you know, the main role I'm looking for. And he's like, I still don't really know what it is. You know, like it's such a kind of confusing term, but I guess it kind of does make sense. And then, you know, there is this idea of people, you know, when a team does bring on these tools, they perhaps have a month, maybe even a quarter of almost like a pilot scheme of let's see how this tool does. And of course, then you've got to feed it all your data and stuff. So, you know, whether that's secure or not. And then is it difficult for a company to then have this GTM engineer or whatever the title is, they bring on this pilot of this tool, they do that, and then after X amount of time, they're like, I'm not sure if this works for us, but we need something, but maybe it can do this. How difficult is it, in your experience, have you seen GTM teams to go from kind of piloting something and trying to figure out whether it works to something actually operating properly and, you know, embedded in part of their, you know, kind of day-to-day workflow?
Yeah, it's really difficult. And again, it's not necessarily just because we're in this era of AI, right? Like I've been around for long enough to have seen how hard it is for any new tooling to ultimately get embedded and adopted within an organization, whether that be a new CRM or, you know, back in the day when you bring in like a sales ops or an outreach to help do your SDR execution or whatever, there's often resistance, right? There's cultural resistance. There's people who want to stick with the old way. They don't want to adopt the new way. So any kind of AI adoption, it's not just a tool issue, right? It is a people issue, a process issue, a cultural issue. You need a change management program, and almost everyone undervalues and underbakes how hard it is to drive all of that change towards true adoption. And there's an enormous amount of pushing a boulder up a hill and then re-pushing it up until you finally get legs under it and it starts to have a momentum of its own. I mean, and again, sorry, just to expand on that, right?
Please.
Just take CRMs, right? CRMs have been around for decades, right? Everyone knows they need one. How often do you see a well-implemented CRM with good quality data that reps actually do populate or want to populate, right? The tech's been there forever, but getting people to adopt it and put it into, you know, workflows is enormously challenging. And so I think it's the same with a lot of AI.
I love that I feel like I keep saying, I love that you brought that up, because I do love what you're bringing up, Mark. But this idea of the CRM as well, and you've said it's been around for decades. And I think sometimes a lot of people either over or underestimate, I'm trying to work it out, over or underestimate AI tools and what they actually do. And often it's not even necessarily an AI tool, it's just automation. And automation has been around for so many years, whether it's outreach or even something like, you know, HubSpot or whatever other CRM of your choice is. Is that something as well where people kind of think that they are, going back to what we said earlier, AI native, and we're doing this, when actually all they're kind of sitting doing is working on a tool that is just providing automation and actually has been for a long time? And looking at it from the outreach side is maybe not necessarily doing a very successful job anymore, because we've seen what's happened with outreach in the last sort of 5 or 6 years. And with AI now, you know, if anything now, like personalized outreach, it smells even worse now, because, you know, suddenly AI is like, hey, you went to this college, and, you know, people can kind of see it from a mile off. I recognize perhaps there's not necessarily a question in there, Mark, but, you know, is it something that you've noticed, that this difference between I guess, an automation tool and an actual true like AI tool that can sort of help make things easier? Or are those lines a lot blurrier than I'm kind of making them out to be, if that makes sense?
It does make sense. I think it's a very astute observation. Like automation is definitely being sold as AI by
That's what I'm
vendors,
getting at. That's what I'm
and
getting at. Yeah, yeah,
it is definitely not
yeah.
AI. Yeah. And again, I think all the vendors have realized they have to position themselves as AI native, going back to that term, right, in order to not lose market share and be
Yeah.
chucked out of an organization. But actually, yeah, they don't pass the sniff test most of the time, right? Like 95% of what they do, 98% is still basic automation. Um, and yeah, they're like trying to plug in little bits of AI and look, AI, or certainly sort of what you might call agentic AI, which I think about as like being able to execute
Yeah.
multiple ambiguous steps in order to get to the end result or a goal that you've set. That is really hard still, right? It's really hard stuff, and most of these organizations, most vendors, are not really capable of delivering that type of AI. So yes, what you end up is a lot of automation dressed up as AI.
Talk to me about agents while you're kind of mentioning there, what do you envision? Or I mean, I mentioned there's probably already experience, but what does that kind of look like within a GTM team? Where does the agentic workflow end and the human workflow begin? I mentioned blurry lines just a second ago, and I think that seems to be a huge theme in AI broadly, but certainly the conversations I'm having on this podcast. And it's nice to actually see people kind of putting lines in the sand now. We did a pit stop. We did an event in Dublin a few weeks ago called Practical AI for GTM, and the broader conversation that came out of the night was human first.
Mm.
Was all these agents and everything amazing. We had a guy called James come on, and here's how I built a AI agent for my social media business for under $50, and it does everything for us and stuff. But then I had him on the podcast the other week, and he was like, "That all sounded good on stage, and of course it's really helpful and everything, but it still has a lot of human input, and I still need to check it all the time and make sure that it's behaving and things." So going on what we said there, there's a certain level of automation there. And like you said, it's being automated to execute, but there is still a lot of human judgment required. So in terms of like agentic AI and bringing that into a GTM team, where do you see the line still being blurry, or where would you draw a line in the sand between agent finishing work, human starting work,
Yeah.
if that makes sense?
So where I've seen what I'd call maybe reasonable agentic adoption or execution has been at this retrieval level, i.e., I've got a lot of messy data. I really don't want to be paying a human to go in and pull it all together, figure out what to keep, what not to keep, and to try and make some sense of it. I think that's probably the best use case I've seen so far of like genuinely autonomous agents going through and scouring enormous amounts of different sources and data and so on, and then trying to apply some sort of sensibility to it. At the same time, it isn't always accurate. And again, this is where you do have to have a human in the loop. And it's surprising how often you will go, well, hang on a second. Did you actually check that file, or did you actually read that script, or, did you actually pull the correct data? And, Claude will go, oh, wonderful point.
Whoops. Yeah.
No, I didn't. So I don't think agentic is there. And that's why
Right.
you need a human in the loop almost all the time, right? More often than not. What I find, I find it quite interesting because I'm really into like all the go-to-market tooling that's coming out,
Cool.
and I feel like people are tying themselves in knots. I don't envy marketers in go-to-market tooling right now, because I think you've got to sell. Everyone's in a bind, where you've got to sell the fact you are true AI, right? So there's a lot around. It's agentic. It's going to save you 90% of your time. It's going to drop your costs of headcount by X, da da da. Because otherwise, the CFO is not going to sign it off, and the board's not going to be excited. In the exact same breath, every vendor's also having to say, by the way, you're not going to fire your entire team, and
Yeah.
we're not going to reduce all humans out of the equation. Partly because anyone with risk in their title won't allow it. And secondly, you actually want the team that you're selling to be excited about you coming in and not being worried about being out of a job 2 months later. So there's this constant, I'm not going to quite say contradiction, but there's a real compromise between this messaging of we're not going to fire all your team and we're not going to let AI agents run wild and therefore pile risk up in your organization. But we are also going to save an enormous amount of time and quite autonomous in how this agent works.
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting paradox to try and wrap my head around. I suppose I'm quite lucky in that with Pitstop, one of our kind of main things is sort of coaching, really, and that's sort of AI to human, and eventually helping the humans help the other humans. So I guess my job is slightly easier. We're less sort of although we're building agents and stuff now, but that will help to facilitate that rather than necessarily replacing.
Yes, yeah,
but
anything that's like really genuinely about augmenting the human, I think is in a good place.
Yes, that's interesting. That's cool to hear from something exterior, because I really like that term, augmenting, and I think that's one that's maybe not used enough because, and I don't know whether it's just media hype or anything like that, but no one ever uses the word augment. They always just use the word replace, don't they? And they're like, that's why I have so many interesting conversations in the pub, Mark, because pretty much all of my friends aren't in this industry at all. So anytime, and someone goes, "Oh, AI is coming for all our jobs," and usually I kind of sit there and I'm like, actually, no, it's not. Like, if you're shit at your job, it's probably going to take your job, But equally, the 7 out of 10 people that aren't rubbish at their job, if anything, they're just gonna. It's not like the company's just going to sit there and go, right, we can be more productive, so let's get rid of a few people and just stay there. It's all that's going to happen is the 7 out of 10 people are just going to be able to do more and ideally make more money, So it's almost like a really self-limiting belief, I think, to assume that just because AI has come in, a few people are going to lose their jobs and then everything's going to stay at the same baseline. That's not what's going to happen. I was, to full transparency, Mark, I'm only I'm 34, so I grew up with the internet, so I don't know what it was like before then. But from what I've been told by people on this podcast and my peers and stuff, they're like, people thought this when the internet came around. It's going to change everything and blah, blah, blah. And all it actually did is make people more productive and able to do more. So I love that you use that term augment. And maybe I'm being glass half full, but I like to think that it's only going to help rather than, kind of hinder, as long as you're middle or above in terms of performance, I guess, especially when it comes to GTM and like a sales team, right?
Yeah, for sure. No, I'm with you. I'm obviously a big optimist in this spot, and again, I do appreciate there'll be losers as well as winners with the rollout of AI, but that is the case in any wave or any innovation. As you said, it's been true through the advent of mobile and apps and the internet and so on and so forth. There's always people that slightly get displaced or lose out, and you've just got to make sure that you are on the right side of that innovation adoption. Just one quick story in case your listeners haven't heard this or seen it, that I found really fascinating. The CEO of ClickUp announced 2 weeks ago, I think it was, that they were laying off maybe 10%, 20% of their workforce. So quite substantial, again, losers, in this equation. Like, got to really feel for them. But it wasn't anything to do with trying to, it wasn't because they were trying to save money. They weren't in any financial constraints. The reason was they wanted to reallocate the budget from those, lower performers, lower productivity roles into higher productivity individuals and actually start creating 7-figure salaries for their best people and give them the AI to be super productive. So,
wow.
Yeah, it's really tough if you find yourself on the wrong side of it, but there's going to be some enormous winners in this new world who end up being able to earn more than they ever thought possible because they're able to utilize AI effectively.
That's so interesting because, I mean, my that was very much a thesis, what I just said there. It wasn't something I'd seen in action. So that's really interesting that ClickUp are doing that. We use ClickUp for a while. It's a good tool. It's a great tool. What about the other side of it then, Mike? Is there ever a point with everything we've just said, is there ever a point where you've gone in and spoken to a CRO, a head of GTM, whoever it is, your touch point within an organization? Is there ever a point where they're maybe not ready for AI yet? Is there a point where you're like, look, before you start investing in tools, agents, automation, let's kind of pull back? I recognize this is maybe a similar question to what we discussed at the start, but hopefully through a slightly different lens. Is that a situation that's you're still maybe finding happening in today's world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, as I said, maybe right at the start, if they don't have those foundations in place, then they're probably not ready for AI, but it doesn't mean they shouldn't start getting themselves ready for AI, right? That's the critical thing. So if I was engaging with a client and maybe they're really, really early stage, I'm going to give you two scenarios, right? One is they're really, really early stage, so they actually just don't have much data to build smart agents on top of. Then the first thing I would do is encourage them to implement certain systems of record to ingest that data in the organization, and then set up some light touch AI to help synthesize that data into a learning system, right? So again, record all your calls, make sure all your emails are accessible, calendar invites, your knowledge base, like all of these core things, Slack, internal communications, all of that. Ideally, you want accessible to AI, and either you should normalize it and put it into a data lake, or you can just give it to something like Claude. But that way you are starting to enable yourself to be, funnily enough, genuinely AI native at that point, right? Because you're small and you haven't built functions without knowledge of how AI can inform decision making. So you may be not quite ready for an execution layer of AI, but you can certainly start to pull the threads together so that you're ready for it. And then the second side of things is, look, you're a slightly later stage organization. Maybe you've already got a sales team, a few million in revenue, and you're like, right, we need to get onto this AI hype train. Where do we start? You've probably got a lot of data already. So you can do the same things I've just talked about, right? You can pull them all together, start to learn things. But the second layer at that point is you want to start setting what best practice is. And that's where you really need to refresh and think through, what is our playbook? What does good look like? And that would typically then live as a set of MD files that you can inform your AI execution layer around. And sorry, I'm getting a little bit more...
No, please carry on. This is great.
Not technical, but what I've come to realize with AI, and there's a lot of hype again around this idea of the context layer within GTM. But when you want an AI agent to do something well, it tends to need two things. It needs this is what good looks like, and these are the guardrails and constraints around which to execute the task. And that's typically best fed as an MD file, because which is essentially just a text file in many respects, right? And it's fast and easy for it to read, and so it doesn't get lost in too much context. But often it also needs what you'd call a RAG, so the retrieval mechanism, where it can go and also pull the raw data from, so that it knows how it's going to execute against this overarching guardrail that's fed by the MD file. So you need these two things working together, and most organizations don't have both things. They usually have one or the other. And that's where sometimes it goes a little bit off kilter.
So interesting, because I think so many people get carried away with, I'm repeating myself here, but they get carried away with the shiny thing. And it sounds so obvious and so almost like stupid how obvious it is, that just build the foundations and get all the data in the right place and get the right files you need to kind of feed this. And it's frankly, it's pretty alarming that it seems that so many organizations just don't do that. They skip their horse before car. I think it was my colleague Patrick said the other day, they're running before they can walk. They're kind of really sort of jumping ahead. I think something you've kind of spoken about when it comes to these tools, and maybe a a tonic for this issue is thinking about a use case for what you would use it for before, investing in a tool or trying to build this thing and put this thing in here. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit? The idea of like having that use case that, a revenue team, a GTM team can actually build something around. Is that like a team kind of discussion that starts? Is it something that you kind of help advise on? Right, okay, what would we actually kind of use this for? What problem is this going to solve within our sort of GTM system? Am I on the right lines there? Is that kind of what that sort of looks like before you then go and grab the tool and start working with it?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And when you start peeling back the layer of the onion and you try and figure out, okay, what's the right use case, you will realize there's an enormous number of things that you could start to apply AI to. I was actually in a working session with a company this week, and we uncovered, gosh, I think it was like 62 different use cases across all the different market functions where there's either inefficiencies or ineffectiveness. And again, there's sort of two pieces there. And I will always go and speak to as many of the go-to-market team as possible before trying to figure out what's the roadmap and what's the plan of action like. But I think there's there's a couple of things, right? One is most individuals will often focus on an AI use case around removing friction from their day-to-day and therefore becoming a little bit more efficient. Which is important and good and like a really good use case. But the other thing that I think is going to become more important as we go into the latter half of 2026 and next year, more and more CFOs are looking at this AI and going, well, we're not going to give you a blank check anymore. I do care how much we're spending on AI. What is the value of it provable to the organization? And so I think there's going to be a second lens that becomes more important, which will be pick your revenue metric, whether it's pipeline or close rates or average deal size. Maybe it's net revenue retention, which is often the thing that gets forgotten about. And you will need to tie your use cases, your AI initiatives, to moving that number in a demonstrable way. And I think that would be good for everyone because you shouldn't be doing it just for the sake of it. You should be doing it to move the needle for your revenue organization.
Do you think that's not happening at the moment just because of the point of kind of history that we're in, where everyone is so excited about these tools and it's also new? And again, something that came up at this event in Dublin, even our founder, Emmett, was like, I've been in the center of this now for, a couple of years and I feel overwhelmed. He kind of said, put your hands, everyone put your hands up in the room if you feel overwhelmed by AI. And I'd say 95% of people put their hands up, and the other 5%, Emmett was like, you're lying, you're not, because, and it was remarkable because, there was about 100 people there and everybody there was within this industry. And it, like yourself, in this on a day-to-day basis and thinking about this. And if they're overwhelmed, no wonder their team are, or the general populace or anything like that. Do you think that there isn't this as much oversight as you just said there, but because of the point of history we're in and everyone's so excited about it? Is that course correction? I know you've said it's going to be a good thing, but do you think that's why it hasn't come yet?
Again, simple answer is yes, right?
Yes. So I'm giving you one answer.
It's a really good hypothesis. I ultimately speed has been the winning factor here, right? Everyone has been, whether it's overwhelmed, excited through fear or greed or whatever, the number one mandate has just been like, go and figure out AI, and the only way to figure it out is to use it. And therefore, it's just like, get it into the organization, whatever guise we can, and then we'll take it from there. And I don't think that's been wrong. Because you do have to, and I do think those first movers and people that get to grips with it will ultimately pull away from those who are laggards. But it's not a silver bullet, and so those people who had that first mover advantage will now quickly start to go, okay, right, we kind of get what it can and can't do, and where we've seen the gaps and where the limitations are. Now we're going to start tying it to proper initiatives. We're going to, start to figure out how to measure this properly. We know that we have to get our infrastructure in the right place and so on, right? But they've only got there by learning by doing in the first place.
Yeah, it's chicken and egg, isn't it? How do we kind of do this? And it's going to be really interesting to see, kind of where it goes. In terms of kind of last sort of question, and this is something that we ask every guest, and it's actually really cool because you've mentioned the execution layer quite a lot over the course of the conversation, and that's not necessarily something people have brought up a lot, and it's something very close to our hearts at Pitstop. It's very much what we're building. But is there somewhere, with your experience of going in and helping organizations, is there one specific point where you see teams breaking down? Where, is there a bottleneck when it comes to execution or performance? Have you noticed, is there a common theme? Is there one thing across all the organizations you work with? Or does it kind of vary organization to organization? I recognize that's maybe a difficult question.
Yeah, it is a tough one. Probably my unhelpful answer is I do think it from organization to organization. And
Okay.
I think it's why the AI execution layer is so hard, because go-to-market teams they're incredibly complex and dynamic, right? They are not just they're not a series of tools or a series of metrics where you can repeatedly go, that's the thing that's wrong. Like sometimes it's nothing to do with tooling or tech at all, right? It's the incentive structure's wrong, the culture's wrong, the strategy's wrong. Half the time it's because excuse my friends, it's because the product's shit. Right?
Yeah.
You can't sell or market something that's not very good. And most want to admit that, and they blame their sales leader or their marketing leader because the product's not very good. Right.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of issues within go-to-market teams where execution breaks down that have nothing to do with tooling, and no tool and no AI could necessarily fix. If I was going to have to plant my flag and not be, it depends, because that's just a boring answer, then
That is a good answer. Yeah.
then I think there's probably a couple of things. One, I still think a lot of more mature organizations, as they start to try and optimize towards what's working, what's not, over-index on attribution, and they either have lack of clarity on attribution, so they don't know where to invest their money, and that kind of stymies things. Most importantly, it starts politics, and then politics leads to misalignment, and misalignment leads to poor execution. So I think that's one thing that I still see very, very frequently. And then the other side of things is probably, actually, they're maybe just the same side point. At a smaller organization, it's less that side. It's more they just don't quite know what is working.
Yeah.
And so best practice is hard to build. They tend to have very wishy-washy playbooks. They try and hire people to go and be heroic in terms of what they do, and then it's very hard to scale that heroism. So building codified best practices tends to be very difficult. Yeah. Anyway, so I've gone on for a bit of a tangent, but those are things those are fairly common patterns that I see.
No. We love a tangent. That's what podcasts are for. It's fascinating, the thing you mentioned at the end there about individual heroics. That's come up so many times, especially with the kind of sales coaches that I've had on. Within GTM, like you said, GTM is still, I guess, a fairly new term. I guess the last decade maybe, but it covers so much. It covers 5, 6, 7 different sort of departments of people. They're obviously getting smaller because of AI. So I understand what you mean, but I love what you said about the individual heroics, and that was that mainly that was raised for previous episodes within a sales team, where you've got one rep that is just vastly outperforming everybody else, and a sales team ends up kind of leaning on this one rep, and then eventually, when that one rep is either promoted to become a sales leader or leaves the organization to go somewhere else for a bigger paycheck, suddenly that team kind of falls apart, because the main answer to this question that we've had is sales leaders are the bottleneck, because they're not given the coaching and support and leadership advice to then pass down that knowledge to a team, because perhaps they were a brilliant AE or a SDR, whatever it is, and they were amazing at that themselves and got loads of deals. So then they were then supported, and they go, right, now you've got 10 people to manage. Go and manage them. And you're like,
Yeah.
well, I don't know how to manage people. I know how to work. I know how to make sales. And I can tell them how to do that. But actually, I was the hero, and you can't teach. Superman can't teach someone else to be Superman. He can teach someone else how to think the way he thinks, maybe, but you can't teach them to fly. So it's right. It's this really interesting point, and I'm glad you kind of brought it up in your own way there with the individual heroics. So yeah, no, it wasn't a tangent at all. In fact, if anything, you brought it right back to what everyone else generally tends to say. And I think, if anything, that kind of gives me hope, because if there was bottlenecks everywhere, I guess we'd have to be more worried, right? But if actually we're realizing there's a common theme of where those sort of bottlenecks are, in a way, you're like, right, well, I know what needs fixing, really, across all these organizations. So yeah, really interesting. Mark, this has been awesome. Thank you for sharing all of your insight, wisdom. I feel we're definitely going to need to do a round 2 at some point. Where can people go if they want to find out more about you and what you get up to?
Yeah, well, firstly, thanks, Andy. I've really enjoyed it. Great fun. If people want to find me, check out LinkedIn. I've got a very common name, Mark Walker. So we come up with about 20 different Mark Walkers, but my actual handle is JFDI Mark, JFDI, which stands for Just Fucking Do It, Mark.
Love it.
Handle I've had for many years, and probably explains a lot of my attitude around being first and getting on with stuff. So yeah, connect on LinkedIn.
Yeah, absolutely. And for anyone looking for that as well, as we said, there's a lot of Mark Walkers, but it will be the one in the show notes below wherever you're watching or listening to this, so you can find it in down there. Mark, thanks again for coming on. Thanks to all of you for listening, and we will see you all for the next one.